Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we'll head to a place that no longer exists, East Prussia. In 1944 and 1945, this region saw some of the fiercest fighting of the late war and was the scene of widespread war crimes. Hi, Jesse. As I keep saying, here we are again, another week, another podcast. I think it's kind of the catchphrase now, isn't it? And as I've just said, we're going east. Once again, we're going to East Prussia. I like the idea of going to East Prussia mainly because when you talk about the terrain, you find many deep, dark woods there. And I haven't used that term in a while, I have to say. And of course, I think what we're going to be doing, I already said in the intro sentence, we're going to be talking about the situation in late 1944, really. So the first time the Soviets enter this area. There are a number of war crimes that are famous, infamous, whatever term you want to use for this. And we'll be analyzing these. But I think what we should be doing before we really go into 1944, maybe as we always do, take a step back and set the scene a little bit and talk about East Prussia. I mean, what is East Prussia? Where does it come from? Why does it not exist anymore? I mean, where do we start with this? I mean, again, this week we could now go back, all the way back to, I don't know, the Middle Ages. Say, where do we want to start?
Oh man, you're giving me a tough choice here. Where do we want to start with East Prussia? Because I feel like the danger here is Matthias is going to run wild with this topic. We're going to be
that can happen.
We're going to be Frederick the Greating for about 3 hours here before we get to World War II. No, yes, I think there's a couple of pieces of context. Maybe I'll start us off slow, and Matthias, you then pick your favorite spots that you want to fill in, as you are definitely the East Prussia expert on our team of two here, not the guy from a farm in Quebec. Anyway, first piece of context though is about why we're talking about East Prussia, and I just want to let you all know out there, viewers and listeners, that this was a topic voted on by our supporters. So if you want to have a vote as to what topics we cover, you can also become a supporter of the podcast if you want at bothsidesofthewire.com. More on that later. As for the historical context, East Prussia is, let's say, one of the cradles of German nationhood, if you will, especially historic nationhood, because, of course, Prussia is a state that ends up being the driving force behind the formation of modern Germany in 1871 when they unify all the smaller German states. So right there, you have a big significance. In addition, Königsberg is the place where the kings in Prussia were crowned for quite a long time. So it has that sort of state history related aspect to it. And then you have this famous aristocratic and military class of people who were responsible for a lot of the driving force in the history of Prussia and Germany over the years, the Junkers. So they provided a lot of the officer class in Prussia and then later in the Kaiser's Germany, and they're still around to some extent in Nazi Germany as well. Why doesn't it exist anymore? Because in 1945, it was taken from defeated Germany with the peace agreements, and then part of it is now a part of Poland, and part of it is now a part of the Russian Federation, the Kaliningrad exclave. So in a very brief nutshell, those are some of the reasons why East Prussia is important beyond the campaign in 44-45 that we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail. Now I've left a ton out of that, as I'm sure Matthias will now enlighten us.
I'm already gearing up here to talk about good old Frederick the Great, to be honest. But actually, I'm not, because we want to get to 45 relatively quickly. You've mentioned all the big hitters. I mean, it really is, as you said, to a large degree, you might say, it is the cradle of United Germany. It is the cradle, particularly of Prussia. which of course is the main part, the biggest state within what then becomes Germany. Even the name, of course, Prussia, comes from this area because you used to have a long time ago. So basically, we're now talking about the Middle Ages, really, in the early modern period. You had a tribe there. They were called the Prutzen in German, and that's where Prussia, the name, comes from. But this really is ancient history, and we don't really want to go there. If you want to, listeners, I mean, it is really fascinating. You've got the Teutonic Order fighting there, the knights, all these things. But that really is now ancient history, so let's park that thought. But this really is where Prussia comes from. So when we now look at the Prussia that exists afterwards, and you say, well, Berlin is the capital of Prussia, and of course then becomes the capital of United Germany. Well, that is a more, you might say, more recent development. In the beginnings, it was East Prussia, and it was actually only called Prussia in those days, not East Prussia. That comes later as well. And Königsberg, and the name is in the word, is in the title. So Königsberg means the king's mountain. That is the translation. You can already see this is where the king sits. And again, Jesse, you've already mentioned it. This is the place where the elector in 1701 decides to crown himself king in Prussia, not of Prussia, but in Prussia, because the Polish king still controls the area and basically is the liege. So that only changes later on when, of course, here we are, good old Frederick the Great comes in, occupies some territories. It had to be, obviously, occupies some territories further to the west that had belonged to Poland beforehand, and so then becomes king of Prussia. But that's all you might perhaps say. I'm not quite sure. Is it dry? Is it boring? But kind of legal history and regal history. But it's all very, very
It's all a question
important.
of taste.
It's a question of taste. And to these guys, of course, this was really, really important. And when you look at the 18th century, the 19th century, the 20th century, East Prussia plays an important role. As you already said, you might perhaps say it's more important in the, what's the right word? The feeling, the legacy, the memory, or whatever you want to call it, of this Prussianhood, rather than its real, for example, economic impact. East Prussia is not big. Say in 1944, 1945, before people flee and before the Soviets arrive, you're looking at around about 2.5 million people that live there. And economically, it's quite poor. There isn't a lot of industry. You have a lot of deep dug woods. You have a lot of lakes. So there's a bit of agriculture, there's fishing, ember trade, but it's not the industrial hub, it's not the mainland. And there are a number of reasons for that. It is the territory and the terrain that you've got. It's the fact that you're actually sitting up there somewhere in the northeast of the country. So you're not in the center, which makes transporting things a little bit difficult. And of course, after the First World War, you then have the problem that East Prussia is cut off from the rest of the German Empire because you've got what is known as the Polish corridor. So you have a number of these issues and problems economically, for example. But as an understanding, as an idea, you might perhaps say, East Prussia is very important to the whole idea of nationhood. And you talked about the East Albion Junkers, so they are very strong there as well. Dear listeners, if you're interested in all these things, and I think it's available in English, if I'm not mistaken, there is this audiobook. You might have watched Babylon Berlin, perhaps. It's a series about this detective that comes to Berlin in the interwar period. And so when you read the books or you listen to the audiobooks, there's actually one episode where he goes to East Prussia. And that is really interesting because it really tells you the tensions that you find in East Prussia between the Germans and the Poles and other groups that are there. And also this insular feeling that people have. They feel completely cut off from the rest of the homeland, as they would call it in those days. So it's really good. I can recommend it. Of course, as we said, and as you also again mentioned, well, these places, of course they still exist, but the legacy is gone. So the names are all changed. The Germans don't live there anymore. And again, we'll return to this and talk about this in a bit more detail. You mentioned Kaliningrad, which of course is the old Königsberg. So all the names have been changed. So this is something that is now pretty much forgotten, even in Germany. This is kind of gone. But that was very, very different all the way to the end of the Second World War. So this is 100% German territory. This is like, I don't know, if you're from Britain, dear listener, well, that's like, I don't know, that's like, let's say Norfolk or whatever it might be. So this is this is German homeland. This is not some sort of weird colony, and it doesn't really matter if it goes. This really is, in many ways, part of the heartland of this particular country. So I think that's also something very important to remember, because this legacy, this link after 1945, of course, has been broken. And I think that was a long ramble. I only mentioned Frank the Great once or twice. I'm very proud of myself.
This is true.
I did well.
Model of restraint. Model of Prussian military Protestant restraint. In any case, let's fast forward to World War II here, folks. So where the rubber meets the road for our podcast. East Prussia becomes one of the, let's say, immediate causes of the war. We've put out several episodes about the beginning of the war with the German invasion of Poland. The fact that East Prussia was separated from the rest of Germany is one of the justifications for the Germans to attack Poland. Then in 1941, it becomes a jumping off point for the wider invasion of the Soviet Union because it borders on the Baltic republics of the Soviet Union in 1941. As the tide turns, it becomes the most exposed, or the first part of Germany proper, to be exposed to potential conquest and occupation by the Red Army. So now we are fast forwarding to, let's start with mid-1944. I think that's a good place to set the immediate table. You have this famous Operation Bagration in summer 1944, where the Soviets launch a massive offensive, mostly in Belarus, and destroy Germany's Army Group Center. And they really push the front quite a bit farther west by several hundred kilometers. This brings them into the region of the Baltics and East Prussia. And building off of that success, because they've completely smashed Army Group Center, German defense is in chaos. They're having a lot of trouble reestablishing, slowing down the Soviet advance, reestablishing some kind of cohesive front. So the Soviets keep pushing, even though they are under a lot of stress as well. It's not easy to keep up that momentum, even when you are stronger than the enemy. So they manage to push along through the Baltics into October. So they kind of reach the Baltic Sea at the beginning of October. And they create a little pocket called the Kurland pocket, in more or less in modern-day Latvia. But that means that south of that, they're looking at East Prussia as the next kind of phase of advancing. So I think if I had to give a bare bones sort of lead up to this offensive into East Prussia in October 1944, I'd start with Bagration and finish up with this, what was it called? The Baltic Offensive, or the Memel Offensive, that brings the Red Army right up to the East Prussian border. And I'll leave the colorful filling in to Matthias here if I've left anything out of that setup.
The interesting question, of course, is why do they feel the need to get into the Baltics? Why do they need to feel to attack Königsberg? Because when you look at the bigger picture and you zoom out a bit, so the Soviet idea, of course, is to get to Berlin as quickly as possible. That's the cradle of fascism, of Nazism. This is where you need to be. But when you look at the map in 1944, even after Bagration, so you've got these corridors, you might say, along the Baltics. And that, of course, is for the Germans, perhaps you might say, flank protection. And for the Soviets, that is a threat. Because if you keep pushing due west towards Berlin, you have very strong German contingents in the Kurland pocket that you mentioned, and also in the area of Königsberg, which of course, East Prussia, which of course at this stage is still linked to mainland Germany. So you could move troops from A to B. That creates a threat in the flank of the Soviet forces. And this is the main reason why they say, you know what, we need to get in there. We need to secure this flank. That means eliminate the German troops there. And that gives us the free hand to then do something against Berlin. So this is the underlying reason. So you might say, from a Soviet point of view, the entire operation in East Prussia is not, from a pure military point of view, is not the most important one, but it is important because it gives you this particular flank protection. Hitler sees all this very differently, and he says, no, this is brilliant because this will make it possible for us to launch these huge counteroffensives and attack the enemy in the rear. I mean, this again is Hitler losing his plot. He's going completely bonkers by now. Everybody tells him that get the troops out, otherwise they will be cut off, which is, and we'll explore that in more detail, of course, exactly what happens here in East Prussia, in Königsberg, also in the Kurland pocket, which in itself is fascinating. We need to do an episode or 2 or 5 on that, because the troops in the Kurland pocket, well, actually, they hold out to the end of the war. So they're encircled there for months and months. So that in itself is interesting. And the Navy always says, we can get them out. We're still controlling, so the German Navy, that is, we're still controlling the Baltic Sea. Hitler says, no, keep them there because they're fixing enemy troops. I just think in 1944, 1945, that really is a little bit barking when you look at this.
Just a quick break, folks, because I wanted to take another moment out of our time here to say thank you. I think that's an important thing to do when people are willing to support our podcasts and what we do, spreading hopefully interest and maybe some knowledge and maybe spurring on some debate about why the Second World War is a very important thing in history to think about, to talk about, to learn about. You know, when someone supports that, we've got to give them credit, I guess, where credit's due. So this is a shout out to one of our colonel level supporters. His name is Vladimir Antic from Serbia. Not so far from where I'm sitting here at home in Vienna, so very glad to have a supporter from the region. If I'm not mistaken, Vladimir is our first colonel level supporter from Serbia, so thank you very much, Vladimir. Hvala. And to all those of you who might be thinking of supporting the podcast, by all means, be like Vladimir and become a supporter of both sides of the wire.
And of course, there's another reason why the Soviets think that an operation into East Prussia is a good idea. And that is not necessarily a military reason, but it's more a reason of ideology. So you've now been fighting this war against the Nazis, the fascist beast, since 1941. And here's the first chance and the first time that you might be able to enter German territory. And that, of course, changes the idea, changes the way you fight, changes everything. For both, you might say, the Soviets, also for the Germans. So for the Soviets, they've now taken the war back to where it started, to where it came from, to the fascist beast. Whereas the Germans, of course, now say, well, now we're defending our homeland. So that changes things as well, which is one of the reasons why the fighting is now, in most areas, is getting harder now and more brutal than it perhaps had been even before on the Eastern Front, because you have these two juxtapositions, you might say. And when you look at the propaganda that is pushed out, and again, something we need to explore in more detail on both sides, you can see that this is now changed on the German side because of a very famous incident we'll talk about in a minute, a massacre that takes place. This is now seen as the embodiment of the brutality of the evil Soviet soldier. Whereas the Soviets say exactly the other way around and say, we've now, as I said, taken the fight back to the fascist beast, and now it's basically, as Ilya Ehrenburg says, it's kill, kill, kill. So he was one of these writers, and he was just trying to get the Soviets, as they entered Germany, to be as brutal as they could. So basically repaying and repayment for what the Germans had done in the Soviet Union. So you can see all sorts of things happening and all sorts of things moving. Also, you mentioned the offensive in 1944, Bagration. The German army in the east, the Wehrmacht, at that particular stage is a broken army. So the main reason why the Soviets do not occupy most of these areas quite quickly is because, to begin with, they're running out of steam. There is a bit of, and again, we'll explore this moment, look at the tactical fighting. There is more fighting. Germany are using defensive positions. The main reason is why the Soviets are not pushing through, because they're exhausted as well, because they've covered such a vast amount of ground at that particular stage. And so the Germans were just basically running away most of the time.
Yeah, I think the propaganda aspect is an interesting one. We're going to come back to that, as you mentioned. Just for our listeners, this person, this propagandist that Matthias mentioned, Ehrenburg, his name is Ilya Ehrenburg, and he's quite interesting. He is a Soviet. He's not practicing, but of Jewish origin, which probably made his job very slightly easier, I would imagine. I think that's not a great stretch. In any case, he's one of many, of course, Soviet propagandists, but he's probably the most famous one for how aggressive his work was. The choice of words, the choice of, imagery. And basically his line on behalf of the Soviet state for whom he's working, right? So his line is approved by Moscow, is we're finally going to enter German territory and we need to do as much damage as possible. There's no innocent Germans, there's no innocent civilians. We just need to take everything out on them for the 4 years of what they've done to us, or the 3.5 years of what they've done to us. This propaganda line of, we need to kill every German, the only good German is a dead German, et cetera, is going to change, but not yet. I think that's also an important little caveat, is that in a few months' time and into 1945, it's not like there are then no atrocities committed by the Red Army. Of course, there still are. But the authorities will try to dial that back because of the reality of, okay, the war is coming to an end now. We're going to have to occupy East Germany, et cetera, et cetera. But this earlier phase is probably where the propaganda is at its most bitter and its most intense. And that does something to explain, not everything, but something to explain what happens. In any case, as far as East Prussia goes, it favors the defender in many ways, I think it's fair to say, because of this type of terrain. You have lots of forests, you have swamps, you have lakes. In 1914, for a very brief First World War aside here, in 1914, this terrain, this difficult terrain, helped the Germans defeat a much, much larger Russian Empire force that was invading in August 1914, because they were able to use what they called the Angarab line, defensive line, based on the Angarab River and a bunch of lakes that are in that area, kind of making a chain. And they were able to shift their forces and hit two Russian armies separately and defeat them separately. Well, now the Soviets are going to face a weaker opponent, it's true, but at the same time, they're still going to face this difficult terrain. And the Germans also have some fortifications to try to take advantage of that. So even though the Germans are much weaker, they do have some of these typical tactical advantages of the defender in terms of terrain and some fortifications. So the Soviets are also a little bit, you have some commanders in Moscow at Stavka who are a bit more aggressive-minded. And then you have others who are saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't, in October 1944, push into East Prussia right away because we need some time. We've just advanced like 700 kilometers in the last 3 months. Even though the Red Army is the most powerful army in the world at the time, they also need time to build roads, rest their men, bring up reinforcements, bring up fuel, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a huge, logistics is a massive operation for the Red Army. It's the biggest army in the world by far. And so you do have a bit of a discussion. Maybe we shouldn't launch into East Prussia right away because we're at the end of our tether, even though we're winning and that's clear and we're stronger. We need some time to kind of reset here a little bit after the big advances. But they are overruled, the more cautious commanders. And in the end, it's decided, okay, in October, we're going to go into East Prussia and begin conquering the homeland of the enemy. The idea is for what they call the Gumbinnen-Goldap operation. These are, Gumbinnen and Goldap are two places in East Prussia. Gumbinnen, famous battle in 1914 as well as part of that campaign. So the idea is that the Third Belarusian Front, that's the army group, right? Soviets call their army groups fronts, is going to break through the German defensive line and exploit with Guards tank armies, essentially. That's usually what they do, is they have these tank armies with more armor in them. And so they're going to break the German lines and then try to exploit that broken line with their armor. The Germans have some defenses. I think they have 6 belts of defenses, but obviously they are in a much weaker position. They have 2 armies, 3rd Panzer and 4th Army, but army is maybe a bit of an exaggeration for them at this time because they're so under strength.
So what do? You've got these troops, you want to seize East Prussia, and as you've said, well, if you're cautious, no, you're overruled. Let's go for it. And of course, in good Soviet style, you throw everything you've got at the defenders. And you already mentioned it. So you've got an entire army groups to front the Third Belarusian one. You always have to be careful when you look at these names, these formations, because they're not always the same strength. They've been fighting. They're not at full fighting power. Russian formations or Soviet formations tend to be smaller than German or Western European ones. So it's a bit difficult to compare these all the time. But if you just look at this just for one moment, so you already said you have 2 armies on the German side, so 4th Army and 3rd Panzer. And on the Soviet side, you've got the 11th Guard Army, the 5th Army, the 28th Army, the 39th Army, the 31st Army, and the 1st Air Army. I mean, just this list of armies already shows you where we're heading with this. So there is a very, very strong superiority on the Soviet side. You're looking at, roughly speaking, again, the figures are always a bit debated, roughly speaking, 400,000 men that the Soviets can use for this offensive. So that gives them a very, very hefty numerical superiority. You also mentioned the German defensive lines, the defensive belts. And as you said, well, the Germans are using this terrain in a very, very clever way. A number of these commanders are fighting. They're actually from East Prussia. They know the terrain. They know how to do these things. And of course, they're all battle-hardened and frontline experienced, so they can do this. And they're using sometimes, because you talked about the First World War, sometimes they're using fortifications, field fortifications as well, that had been built even before the First World War. That will become very important later again when we look at Königsberg itself. And of course, they strengthen all these defensives here. And that means that when on the 16th of October, the Soviets then attack, they push in there with force against the defensive line that you already mentioned. But immediately they run into problems because the German defensive line is organized in a very clever way. They're trying to use as many heavy weapons as possible. And they start to inflict quite heavy casualties on the Soviet forces immediately. And that means that initially the Soviets are only able to penetrate about 11 kilometers into this German defensive belt, which is much, much deeper. So you might say the opening stage of this particular battle, so the Gumbinnen or the first East Prussia operation, is you might say German defensive victory, a tactical
defensive
one.
victory.
Defensive victory for the Germans. Yeah.
It's very optimistic there for a moment.
But exactly. But what does that mean? How does it help you? I mean, that's it. Because the Soviets have got more forces, they can commit more, and they keep pushing it. They keep pushing. Relatively early on, they need to release an extra corps because the casualties that they've suffered in the first 1 or 2 days are so heavy that they're already beginning to run out of manpower in the frontline troops. But they do have more, and so they can deploy these troops and keep pushing. And that is the Second Guard Tank Corps, which is deployed very, very early on. And so the Soviet casualties are very, very heavy. They keep fighting their way forward. They keep fighting their way towards this place called Gumbinnen that you mentioned, which is defended by an anti-aircraft division, which again tells you a little bit about the German makeup of forces, because
That's
these
not a
guys
good
are
sign.
not really. No, exactly. They're not trained in fighting in ground combat roles. So you can see the Germans are just getting ready or getting together everything that they have. But they also have the Fallschirmjäger Panzerdivision Hermann Göring, which on paper at this stage is still an elite formation, in reality a bit different. It is quite funny anyway, when you think about this. Fallschirmjäger, a paratrooper tank division. Always try to picture how you get a tank into play and throw it out. So, of course, there's politics behind this. Göring wants a tank division, so he gives a few tanks to these guys. The whole thing is really a bit weird, but there we are. And so the Soviets keep pushing it. They keep fighting forward. But in the northern area, at around the 21st of October, so we're now about 5-6 days into the campaign, the Soviet offensive is first stopped in the region of, it's called Ebenrode. Again, this is now a different name that you have today, because the Germans do what they always do if they still have the means, and that means they launch local counterattacks. As the good old saying goes, and I might have used this one before, 3 things are certain in life: death, tax, and the German counterattack. So there
Indeed.
we are. The Germans bring forward all the remaining troops that they have. And that, for example, also includes a heavy Panzer Detachment 505. So that is equipped with Tiger tanks, so King Tigers. And they launched these local counterattacks, and they managed to push the Soviets back, and they reconquer, for example, Gumbin, and also Nemmersdorf, a place that we will have to talk about in a minute. And then basically towards the end of November, again, that you can just debate the dates a little bit. Most people say either it's the 3rd of November, or some people say the 3rd of October. This is where this operation then comes to an end, because the Soviets have suffered very heavy casualties. The Germans have been pushed back, but then they're able to counterattack. They're more or less, I wouldn't say able to hold the line, so they lose territory, but they haven't been defeated. They haven't been crushed. And now the Soviets realize that this operation needs more preparation. It needs more forces. It does need reinforcements, and only then will they be able to really push through and do whatever they want to do in this part of the world. And this style of fighting and all these things is also reflected in the casualties of this first operation, the first East Prussia operation. Again, you need to be a bit careful when you look at casualties. I mean, the German casualty figures, even at that stage, I would argue, are still relatively reliable. It's only at the later stages, when you really go into 1945, where the German administration more or less collapses, that it's sometimes a bit difficult to say what the German casualties were. When you go to the Soviet side, it's a very different story, and you always have to take Soviet casualty figures not with a pinch, but with a kilo of salt, I would say, because that, for all sorts of reasons. Either the reporting wasn't very good, they weren't recorded, political reasons as well. So all sorts of issues and problems. But if you go with the numbers that people have brought forward, again, pinch of salt is required. You're looking at somewhere in the region of 15 to 16,000 German casualties. That's about 6 to 7,000 killed and the others wounded. About 115 to 120 tanks and self-propelled guns, somewhere in that region. The Soviets, on the other side, the official figures speak of about 80,000 casualties and about 900 tanks and assault guns. So that's still a heavy blood loss on the Soviet side. So this is not, even though we said the Germans are weaker and they've been running away and it's all very difficult for them, they're still able to put up a fight and they're still able to inflict casualties on the Soviets. But everybody knows, including the Germans, that this was just the first step. There is more to come. There's going to be another offensive. The war, the fighting in East Prussia isn't over at that particular stage, at the end of October, early beginning of November 1944.
Right, so it turns out that those Red Army commanders who urged caution and more preparation were probably right. Because in the end, even if you have the superiority that they were able to bring to the table, they just didn't have enough in order to achieve what they wanted to achieve, which was a major operational breakthrough. Instead, it's a grinding sort of, we push you back, we push you back. I think in all they advance between 30 and 60 kilometers or so. They do capture some part of actual German territory, which is a political win from the Soviet point of view, but at a severe cost. So they wind things down, as you mentioned, by the beginning of November. This German counteroffensive actually pushes them back in several places, recovers much of the territory that's lost. And it's Zhukov and Rokossovsky, two famous Soviet marshals, right, who are among the smarter ones, less motivated by politics in this case, who basically say, look, we got to wind this down. And they're able to carry the day with their argument after basically 2.5 weeks of not pointless attacks, but attacks that are not very efficient from the Soviet point of view and aren't able to achieve in the end what they wanted to achieve. So that kind of rounds up the story of that operation. But as usual, war is politics by other means. War involves more than just soldiers fighting soldiers, especially the Second World War. So let's go back to this infamous village, this village of Nemmersdorf, which the Soviets capture on the 20th or 21st of October. And then all hell breaks loose.
Yes, it does. As we said, this is now pretty much the first time that the Soviets are entering German territory. And as the Germans would then later state and claim, well, the Soviet beast was now unleashed. And what happens is, as you said, the Soviets managed to get into Nemmersdorf. They managed to seize Nemmersdorf. So this is the 25th Guards Tank Brigade, the second battalion of them, if you really want to go down and drill into this. And they managed to get across the river. They managed to seize this village. They keep pushing, but then there's another German counterattack coming in. The Germans now really rallying their forces because they're now again defending German territory. So it's important to get this back. And as they then basically managed to launch this counterattack, and the Soviet tank brigade is ordered to retreat across the river and take defensive positions on the other side of the river, the Wehrmacht basically enters this village of Nemmersdorf and basically discovers a massacre. And this is the big Nemmersdorf massacre, in which, again, the figures and numbers are debated. Some of the figures, the official figures, speak of 74 German civilians that are killed and executed by the Soviets as they enter the village. Interesting enough, also about 50 French and Belgian prisoners of war who'd been moved there probably to help on the farms, and they were executed by the Soviets as well. And this all goes back to this whole thing that we already mentioned, Ilya Ehrenburg. So kill, 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 kill as many as you can, no mercy given. And that's what the Germans basically claim that they find. And there are some extremely gruesome stories when you look at or when you read some of the accounts, or you can even actually see some of this, not the most brutal stuff, but some of it on the German newsreels. For example, you can find them on YouTube, where the account says, for example, that you had girls and women nailed to either crosses or to barn doors. All these things are really nasty stuff, not just killing people, but doing it in a very, very nasty way. You had well, you might perhaps say, unfortunately, it's the typical rapes of women. So this causes a huge outcry. And now, of course, the reaction on the German side is also very interesting, because you could do things. Well, two things you could do. The first thing is, well, you kind of try to keep quiet perhaps about this, because that doesn't send out a very strong message about, well, Germany and the army being able to defend its fatherland, protect the women and children, or you go in all guns blazing. And this is exactly what they do from a propaganda point of view. And Goebbels says, well, this is brilliant. This is a godsend. Talks about this, writes about this. They send the film teams there, as I say, and they line up all the dead people, including the children, and say, well, this is what you're fighting for. So make sure this will never happen again. So you can see it's really, really used by the Nazis as a propaganda tool or event or godsend, whatever you want to call it. They get an international commission in as well to analyze this. Now, interesting is, where did these people come from? Some come from Estonia, which, of course, in those days is not particularly pro-Russian, I would say. Some people come from Francoist Spain. Again, you might argue how international and how neutral are these people, really? But that's a different discussion. They show them everything and say, yep, you know what, this is where the atrocities happened. And so this becomes a big thing, a huge thing in German propaganda all the way to the end of the war. So you might say the tables have now been turned, and it's the Germans defending their homeland against the Soviet beasts, whereas the Soviets have been doing the other thing, or the same thing the other way around, so to speak. So it's a huge thing. It's really, really important. And in those days, everybody knew what Nemmersdorf meant. Well, I even remember growing up, my grandparents quite often mentioning Nemmersdorf when they were talking about Cold War, Soviet occupations, and these things. So this was a story and an event that was extremely well known, not least because it was publicized.
Yeah, I was going to say, this shows in a way the power of propaganda, because of course, it's a terrible atrocity. And those 75 plus people and those several dozen French and Belgian prisoners of war should not have been killed. And the perpetrators should have, in theory, in a perfect world, been held to account, which of course they were not. On the other hand, it is interesting to think about 75 people's not a lot when we think about World War II atrocity numbers and statistics, not in Germany, not in the Soviet Union. So the fact that this was the first big atrocity carried out by the Red Army on German soil is what gives it its staying power. It's why people remembered that name for so long, because much worse happened in the Soviet Union, carried out by the Germans, and then much more widespread. I don't know about degree of brutality. That's a bit hard to qualify, let's say. But certainly far more Germans were killed in other places, like in Berlin, for example, by the Red Army. But it's this symbolism, I think, that's a big part of what stays with these stories of atrocities in many cases. Now, as I say, the Soviets try to change their policy towards the Germans later in 1945, but here it's at the kind of peak revenge, right? Because if you think about how much the Soviet Union lost and in what way it lost it, and how many millions of Soviet women were raped and villages burned and killed and so on and so forth, we're into the tens of millions, right? Revenge is a huge factor. And somebody like Ehrenburg is creating his propaganda on a very fertile field of people's minds, of Soviet soldiers' minds, for example. Then I think you also have the factor of discipline, right? The Red Army is probably the most effective fighting force in the world, on the ground anyway, but it's not particularly well disciplined. And so if you already have partially weak discipline in your ranks, in wartime where people have a license to kill and normal laws and normal restrictions don't apply and normal ethics don't apply, you are going to have people killing people when it shouldn't happen, even in a wartime context. But the Red Army is even less disciplined than a normal European army, let's say, would be at this time. So you're going to have even more of that. So there's a bunch of different factors. Revenge is obviously one that's easy for us to think about and grasp. But I think there's some, I don't know, kind of sociological factors about the institution of an army and how it functions. Group pressures of men sort of thinking, well, I've got to prove that I am as manly and as lethal as the guys next to me, and I don't want them to think I'm weak and all this kind of stuff. There's quite a few different historical studies that have explored those aspects of the Red Army atrocities, and not trying to justify them, obviously, but trying to understand how these things happen with groups of people in wartime. So that I thought was an interesting piece of trying to understand a bit more about the Nemmersdorf massacre and then the other atrocities carried out by the Red Army later in Germany. And the propaganda is very effective. I mean, there's a wave of suicides in Eastern Germany, primarily for these last months of the war. And the Nemmersdorf massacre and its use as propaganda by the Nazi government certainly plays a role in that. There are, I think, if memory serves, more than 10,000 Germans killed themselves in 44, 45, which is wild. And sometimes there are group suicides of up to several hundred people at once. I mean, this is quite outside the norm, even for wartime, with a few exceptions, I would say. So yeah, Nemmersdorf, 75 people in the context of World War II is not a big number, but it has, especially for the German-Soviet war, it has this outsized impact, right? Which makes sense if you see it in the context.
Maybe just one additional point, because you talked about the violence and where the violence and revenge and all these things, where they come from. I would also argue that a military is always a mirror and embodiment of society where these people come from. And if you have a Soviet society, which even back in the Soviet Union is more brutal, is harsher, where violence is more accepted. And you just need to look at the treatment of Soviet and Russian conscripts. There's a very different approach to violence. And if you're exposed to this growing up, in inverted commas, violence becomes a bit more normal, perhaps. That's another contributing factor. We always, not always, but quite often, we think that militaries are these organisms that exist outside and completely detached from wider society and the wider world, because we say they've got their own rules, they've got their own set of whatever, they've got their own clothes, they've got their drills. That is all very true. And yet, while the first socialization of people happens while they're at home, while they're in civilian society, only from there do you move into the military. And all militaries over the centuries have tried to beat out these civilian roots of people. It doesn't work because this is where it comes from. So it's just another underlying factor that, again, doesn't excuse it, doesn't explain it, but maybe it's just one little piece in this jigsaw.
Yeah, I think it goes to the heart of why historians spend so much time trying to explain crimes against humanity, the Holocaust, different atrocities and war crimes, because the people committing them are humans, whether they're Germans doing it to Soviets and Jews or Soviets doing it to Germans. And so it needs an explanation because it's not considered a normal human thing to do. In any case, I wanted to round off our episode here about the October 1944 offensive into East Prussia with a word about some of the civilians who are not a part of the massacres, but of course, who are affected by the invasion and by the propaganda. As you said, East Prussia is not particularly densely settled, but still, I think there are something like 2.5 million people living in East Prussia at the time. There are not very effective plans for the evacuation of civilians by the Nazi authorities. That will be a theme for the whole rest of the war, including the famous, infamous battle at Berlin, where they don't really make proper plans for evacuation. But they do try to evacuate some civilians belatedly. Essentially, they try to flee as the Soviets are advancing. And one of the focal points for this becomes a place in English known as the Vistula Lagoon, in German, the fiercest Haff. It's kind of near Königsberg. There's a sort of a piece of the Baltic Sea that's kind of partially cut off by a thin little spit, and it's very shallow, something like 5 meters deep, I think, only. And so in order to get to ships and boats to take them off and back to other parts of Germany, a lot of the civilians end up having to trek or make their way across or through shallow parts of this fiercest Haff, which of course is partly frozen at the time, and they're exposed to the cold weather in October. It's quite a difficult situation. I think about 500,000 in fall 1944 East Prussians tried to escape. There's a port town called Pilau that is another major escape route. So I didn't want us to talk about East Prussia in 1944 without a word. Of course, the civilian experience is much worse than in 1945, which we'll get into in a subsequent episode. But already in 1944, you have 500,000 people driven away from their homes, fleeing in these cold and difficult conditions. So that was my final thought for the episode today. I don't know, Matthias, do you have any other closing words? Are we going to round it out for October 44 in East Prussia?
I think we can wrap it up. Mm-hmm.
Very well. In that case, that was today's episode. East Prussia, October 1944. The Soviets, they try for a bridge too far, and they have to call off the offensive without the breakthrough that they were hoping for. A bitter German defense, for what it's worth, kind of temporarily succeeds. And you have this Nemmersdorf massacre that becomes a big symbol for Soviet atrocities and for what the Nazis try to make out of those Soviet atrocities. So thanks for being with us, listeners and viewers. If you like what we do here at the podcast, of course, feel free to become a podcast supporter if you wish. You can do that by going to bothsidesofthewire.com. If you use the code DeepDarkWoods, and of course, if you listen to the beginning of today's episode, you'll understand why we chose that code, you will get access to our supporter community. We have the War Room, where there's exclusive material that's not available on the public version of the podcast as well. And you can try that all out for free for 1 month using the code DeepDarkWoods. So thank you to all our current supporters, and we hope to have welcome some of you to our community as future supporters. And we'll see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. Access to our supporter community and to the War Room, where we give free. Damn it, it's not free. That's why it's the War Room. Hang on, Linus, you got to cut that. You got to cut that. You got to cut that out.
Best things in life are not free. There we are.
Exactly.